The first thing I heard when I walked through the door was my father's voice carrying across the living room, sharp and certain the way it always was when he wanted an audience. "There she is," he said. Finally. He didn't say it like he was glad I'd made it. He said it like he'd been waiting to make a point, and I had just walked in and handed it to him. I set my coat on the hook by the door the way I always did growing up. The second hook from the left, the one that had always been mine. My brother's jacket was already there, and beside it, something new. A woman's wool coat, pale gray, with a silk lining I could see at the collar. That would be his fiancé's. I hadn't met her yet. That was the reason I'd made the 7-hour drive from Toronto on a Thursday in February, through snowfall that turned the 400 into a slow crawl somewhere past Barrie. I was here for my brother. I kept telling myself that the whole way up. My mother came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and gave me a hug that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and no longer. She smelled like the same lavender hand cream she'd used my whole life. I held on to that for a second. "You look tired," she said. "Long drive," I said. "You should have come yesterday." I didn't answer that. The living room was fuller than I expected. My brother's future in-laws were already there, a woman with silver hair sitting very straight on the couch, and beside her, a man I didn't recognize at first, maybe late 60s, broad-shouldered, with the quiet stillness of someone who was used to being in rooms where things mattered. My aunt and uncle were in the corner with their teenage son, who was staring at his phone. My father was standing near the fireplace with a glass of rye in his hand, looking like he'd been planted there. My brother came out of the kitchen and crossed the room in 3 steps, and hugged me properly, the way people hug when they actually mean it. He was 28 now, somehow, which didn't feel possible. The last time I'd seen him in person, he'd just started his electrician's apprenticeship. "I'm glad you came," he said quietly. "I wouldn't have missed it," I said. That was true. He introduced me to his fiancée, who had warm eyes and a firm handshake and said she'd heard a lot about me. I didn't know what that meant, exactly, given that there wasn't much my family knew to say. She introduced me to her mother, who was gracious and easy to talk to. Then she gestured to the man on the couch. "And this is my father," she said. He stood to shake my hand, and when our eyes met, something shifted in his face just slightly, the way it does when a person is trying to place something they're almost certain of but not quite. I smiled. I shook his hand. I moved on. My father watched all of this from across the room. I should tell you about my father, because without that, none of what came later will make any sense. He's not a cruel man. I want to be careful how I say this, because the easy version, the version where there's a villain and a victim and everything is simple, isn't actually true. He worked 32 years at the mill in Espanola before it scaled back, and then he drove truck for another decade after that, long hauls down to Windsor and back, and he did it without complaint because that was what providing looked like in his mind. He coached my brother's hockey team for 6 years. He showed up. In the ways he understood showing up, he always showed up. But there was a smallness to his vision of what a person could be, and I don't mean that as an insult. I mean it literally. The world, in his experience, had a ceiling, and people who thought they could go higher than that ceiling were either fooling themselves or putting on airs, and either way they were headed for embarrassment. He'd seen it. He had examples. The Peterson boy who went to Queen's and came back with a useless degree and had to work at Canadian Tire for 3 years. His own brother who borrowed against his house for a franchise that didn't take off. Evidence, he felt, was on his side. When I got into McMaster's health sciences program at 18, he said, "What does that get you?" When I got into medical school at the University of Toronto at 22, he said, "That's a long road for a woman to be walking alone." I didn't know what he meant by that exactly. I still don't. But I heard it, and I filed it, and I kept going. The first 2 years of med school were fine. I called home on Sundays. My mother asked about the food and the weather and whether I was sleeping enough. My father asked when I'd be done and what I'd specialize in, and when I said internal medicine with a cardiac focus, he said, "So not a real surgeon then." I explained that the path wasn't settled yet. He said he'd heard that residency hours were brutal, and that a lot of people burned out and dropped off partway through, and had I thought about what I'd do if that happened. I told him I didn't plan on that happening. He said plans and outcomes weren't the same thing. I stopped calling quite as often after that. Not because of any single conversation, but because each one left a residue I had to spend days scrubbing off, and I couldn't afford that. The work was too hard. The stakes were too real. I was spending 18-hour shifts on a cardiac surgical unit learning how to do things that most people only see on television, and I needed every bit of myself intact to do it well. He took the reduced calls as confirmation of what he already suspected. My mother told me later that he'd said to her, "She's pulling away because it isn't going well and she doesn't want us to see." I didn't know he thought that until much later. By then, I had stopped trying to correct the record. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to make someone believe in you who has already decided not to. I reached that exhaustion somewhere around my 3rd year of residency. I was 27 years old. I had not slept more than 5 consecutive hours in 3 weeks, and I had just spent 4 hours in an operating room keeping a 53-year-old man's heart beating while a team of 8 people worked around me. When I came out of that room, I didn't call my father to tell him. I sat in the locker room for 12 minutes and ate a granola bar and then went back to work. That was when I stopped needing him to know. The decision to come to my brother's engagement party was not simple. He'd asked me twice, very quietly, and I could hear in his voice that he meant it. He was the one person in that house who had never made me feel like I was failing a test I didn't know I was taking. When I told him years ago that I was pursuing cardiac surgery, he said, "That's insane, I think that's amazing." He said both things at once, and meant both equally. That was my brother. So I drove 7 hours in February snow, and I walked through the door and my father said, "There she is. Finally." The party wasn't large. Maybe 12 people in total, spread between the living room and the kitchen. My brother had set out a charcuterie board on the coffee table and there was a case of Molson in the garage, and my mother had made her cabbage rolls, which meant she'd been cooking since the day before. It was a real welcome, in the way she knew how to make one. I sat with my brother and his fiancée for the first hour, and they told me how they'd met at a fall fair in Sudbury, of all things, and how he'd proposed at Killarney Provincial Park last September, in the rain, because the weather changed and he didn't want to wait. She laughed telling it. He looked at her the way people look at someone they're still a little amazed they get to have. It was good. It was genuinely good, and I felt that. My father circulated. He talked to his future son-in-law's parents with the careful friendliness of a man on his best behavior. I watched him with the fiancé's father, the quiet man with the silver at his temples who had looked at me strangely when we were introduced. They talked for a while near the window. I noticed the man glance at me once while my father was speaking. It was around 8 o'clock when it happened. My aunt, who has a talent for landing in the middle of things, said to the room more or less generally, "So what is it you do now?" "I can never keep track." She was looking at me. I said, "I'm based in Toronto." "Yes, but doing what?" There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. My father set his glass down on the mantel. "She's been figuring that out for a while," he said. His voice was pleasant. That was the thing about my father, the sharpest things he said pleasantly. "Some people take a little longer to find their footing." "Nothing wrong with that." "I'm not figuring anything out," I said. "Well, you haven't exactly settled," he said. "That's all I mean." "You're not," he gestured vaguely, in the direction of my brother and his fiancée. "You don't have what he has built here. At your age." "She's 32, not 60, my brother said. "I'm just saying." My father picked his glass back up. "Different paths. She always wanted to do her own thing, go her own way. I respect that. I just hope it's working out." The way he said "I hope it's working out" sounded exactly like "I don't think it is." The room had gone quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when people are pretending they're not listening. My aunt looked at her plate. My mother had appeared in the doorway from the kitchen. "It's working out fine," I said. I kept my voice even. "Good," he said. "Good. You always were stubborn. Sometimes that's an asset. Sometimes." That word did its work. I looked at the mantel. I looked at the family photo from 2009 that had been there my whole life. My brother and me in our hockey gear. I played defense for 2 seasons before I quit to focus on school, which my father had also had opinions about. I thought about the drive back down the 400. I thought about the surgery I had scheduled for Tuesday morning. A valve replacement on a 60-year-old teacher from Brampton who had 2 grandchildren and a husband who held her hand every time I came into the room to talk. I thought about how none of that was in this room, and how this room had no idea. I was setting down my glass to go find my coat when the fiancé's father spoke. He had been quiet for most of the evening, in the way some people are quiet not because they have nothing to say but because they are careful with words. He was still sitting in the same chair near the couch, and he looked at my father with an expression that was entirely courteous and not especially warm. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't mean to interrupt." My father turned. "I should have said something earlier," the man said. When we were introduced, I wasn't certain at first. He looked at me. You were at St. Michael's. Cardiac surgery. 2 years ago. Maybe close to 3. I looked at him. Richard Calloway, he said. I don't expect you to remember. You had a lot of patience. I did remember. Not the name, not immediately, but the face, yes. The ICU, post-op, the second week of January, the kind of cold that comes off Lake Ontario and gets into the building anyway. A triple bypass on a man who had presented as a straightforward case and then wasn't. 7.5 hours. I had been 30 years old. I remember, I said quietly. He nodded. He looked back at my father, and his voice was the same, careful, pleasant register it had been all evening. Your daughter operated on me, he said. I was told afterward that the surgery became complicated, that the attending made a call that most surgeons wouldn't have been comfortable making at her level of experience, and that it was the right call. He paused. I had a recovery that my own cardiologist described as, and I'm quoting, unlikely. He looked at his daughter across the room and then back at my father. She's the reason I'm sitting here tonight. The reason I was able to walk her down the aisle last spring. The reason my grandchildren have a grandfather. No one said anything. So when you say you hope it's working out, he said, I can tell you that from where I sit, it's working out very well. My father looked at me. I don't know what I looked like in that moment. I wasn't performing anything. I was just standing there, in the house I grew up in, next to the mantel with the photo from 2009, holding an empty glass. You're a surgeon, my father said. Yes, I said. You've been for how long? I finished my fellowship 4 years ago, I said. I've been on staff at St. Michael's for 3. He looked at my mother. She was still standing in the kitchen doorway, and her expression was the one she gets when she has known something for a long time and has been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for it to arrive. Why didn't you tell us? He said. I thought about all the Sundays I had called. I thought about the long road for a woman to walk alone. I thought about plans and outcomes not being the same thing. I thought about sitting in a locker room at 11 o'clock at night eating a granola bar, not calling anyone, because I had learned that the call would cost more than it gave. I don't know, I said. That wasn't entirely true, but it was the truest thing I could say in that room. At that moment, in front of 12 people I was still in the middle of loving, even when I wasn't sure I should. My brother crossed the room and put his hand on my shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. My aunt made a sound that was the beginning of a sentence, and then thought better of it. The fiancée went to her father and bent down to say something quietly near his ear, and he covered her hand with his and said something back. My father was still looking at me. I had imagined this moment, in the abstract, over the years. Not planned for it, exactly, but wondered about it, what it would feel like, what I would want to say. I had thought it would feel like something being settled, balanced. I had thought there would be a satisfaction to it, some clean click of a thing finally landing in the right place. It didn't feel like that. It felt like standing in a room where a light had been turned on that everyone had been pretending wasn't off, and now there was nowhere comfortable to look. I should get going, I said. It's a long drive. You're not staying the night? My mother said. I have an early morning, I said. That wasn't true, but I needed the drive. I needed the 400 at night, the dark fields on either side, the slow movement of other people's headlights going south. My brother walked me to the door. He helped me into my coat without being asked, the way he used to when we were kids and I was rushing. You didn't have to come, he said. Yes, I did, I said. He hugged me again, longer this time. I'm sorry, he said. Don't be, I said. This was a good night. Your fiancé is wonderful. Her father is a good man. He really is, my brother said. I picked up my keys. Behind me, across the living room, I heard my father's voice. He wasn't speaking loudly. He said my name. Just my name. The way he said it when I was 8 years old and had done something he wasn't sure how to talk to me about. Not angry, not proud. Just my name. Like a door he wasn't sure he had the right to knock on anymore. I turned around. He was standing in the same place he'd been standing all evening, near the fireplace, but the rye was on the mantel now, and his hands were at his sides. He looked like a man who had just realized that he had been looking at a house from across the street for so long that he had assumed he knew what was inside it. We looked at each other across the living room. There are things you can't fix in a doorway. There are things you can't undo in a single evening, no matter what gets revealed, no matter how many years of quiet you finally explain. I knew that. I had known it for a long time, and knowing it had been its own kind of grief, separate from anger, more like the feeling of a window that's been painted shut, where you can see through the glass just fine but the air doesn't move. I didn't know if it would ever move. I didn't know if this was the beginning of something or just a fact that had finally been said out loud. But he said my name like a door. And I looked at him, and for a moment neither of us looked away. Then I said goodnight to the room, and I stepped outside. The cold hit me the way February cold in northern Ontario always does, not gradually, but all at once, a full stop. The snow in the driveway had compacted into ice in the hours since I'd arrived, and the stars were out, which happens after the clouds have finished with you, when the sky clears and goes very dark and very still. I sat in my car for a few minutes before I started it. I thought about Richard Calloway sitting in the ICU, 6 days post-op, asking me when he could travel because his daughter was getting married in the spring. I had told him to let his body tell him, and he had laughed and said his body had always been stubborn. I had said that could be useful. He had looked at me over the railing of his bed and said, "Thank you. I mean that properly, not just for the surgery." I hadn't known what he meant by the last part. I hadn't asked. There were 12 more patients on the ward and a second surgery scheduled for the afternoon, and I had written in his chart and moved on. I wondered if he had ever told his daughter about that conversation. I wondered if that was why she was easy to talk to. That warmth in her eyes when she looked at me, whether she had grown up knowing that some stranger in a Toronto hospital had kept the lights on for her father, and whether that had made her see the world slightly differently. I started the car. I let it warm up. I turned on the radio and found CBC, and let it fill the silence while the defroster cleared the windshield. At some point before I pulled out of the driveway, the front door of the house opened. Just briefly. A rectangle of yellow light, and in it, my father's shape. He was wearing his wool house slippers and he must have been cold, but he stood there anyway. He didn't say anything. I don't think he could see me through the windshield with the headlights off and the ice still half frosted on the glass. But he stood there. I don't know how long he stood there. I put the car in reverse and backed slowly out of the driveway, and when I looked back, he was still standing in the door. I drove south. For the first hour, I didn't think about any of it. Or I tried not to, because there was ice on the road past Perry Sound and that required attention. I passed a transport truck pulled over with its hazards on and I gave it room. I passed a Tim Hortons in Barrie that was lit up against the dark like a small planet, and I thought about stopping, but I didn't. By the time the outskirts of the city started coming into view, the slow accumulation of lights, the widening of the highway, the shift in the quality of dark from rural to urban, I let myself think about it. Here is what I kept coming back to. The question my father asked was, "Why didn't you tell us?" I had said I didn't know, but driving south in the dark, I thought I did know, or at least I knew part of it. I hadn't told them because I had stopped needing them to know. Not because I stopped wanting them to be proud of me. You don't stop wanting that, I don't think. Not entirely. Not if you're honest, but because at some point the wanting and the not having had coexisted for so long that I had built around it. Insulated it. Made it bearable by making it irrelevant to my daily functioning. And the question I was sitting with now, on the 400 South with the Toronto skyline beginning to glow ahead of me, was whether irrelevant was the same as healed. I didn't think it was. I thought about what my brother had said. "I'm sorry." I thought about how quickly I'd told him not to be, and how I'd meant it, and how meaning it didn't mean there was nothing to be sorry for. I thought about the way my father said my name, at the end, standing by the fireplace with his hands at his sides, not as a command and not as an accusation, just as a name, just as me. I was going to have to figure out what to do with that. I didn't know yet. I didn't have a tidy resolution packaged up. I had a 7-hour drive that I was halfway through, and a surgery on Tuesday, and a voicemail I hadn't listened to yet from a colleague at the hospital about a consult, and a life that was full and demanding and real and almost entirely mine, built by me, from scratch, in a city 7 hours south of the house I grew up in. That was not nothing. I turned up the radio a little. Someone on the overnight program was talking about the weather system coming in from the west, which would hit the city by morning. I thought about my patient on Tuesday, the teacher from Brampton. I thought about her husband, who always held her hand. I thought about Richard Calloway dancing at his daughter's wedding in the spring, in a province where the springs are still cold, but they come. Eventually, they always come. The city opened up ahead of me. The lights multiplied. I took the exit toward downtown and drove until I could see the lake, black and enormous on my left, and then I drove a little farther, just because I could, just because it was quiet and the road was mine and there was no particular reason to stop. My phone lit up on the passenger seat. I waited until the light turned red to look. It was my brother. A text, not a call. It said, "She wants you at the wedding. So do I. Drive safe. Call me when you're home." I stared at it for a moment. The light turned green. I set the phone down and kept driving. At some point, I would call him back. At some point, I would have to decide what came next, whether next meant a conversation with my father, whether it meant bringing things into the light that had lived in the dark for a long time, whether it meant something more or simply something different from what we'd had. I didn't know yet. But I drove home through a city that was mine, to an apartment that was mine, to a life I had built without asking anyone's permission, and when I finally pulled into the parking garage and turned off the engine and sat in the quiet, I didn't feel the clean click I'd always imagined. I felt something more complicated than that. I felt like a person at the beginning of a conversation that should have started a long time ago, and that was going to be hard, and that might or might not go the way I needed it to go. I felt, for the first time in a long time, like it mattered enough to try. I picked up my phone. I typed, "Home safe. I'll call tomorrow." I sent it. Then I got out of the car, took the elevator up, unlocked my door, and went inside.